when we look at the book of Deuteronomy, for example, we see an introduction, several speeches by Moses, and then several chapters of conclusion, including extraordinary poetry. But we have to remember, the book was written toward the end of the 600s BCE. So to stay loyal to the book, we can say these are the speeches that Moses gave to the Israelites before they crossed over the Jordan into Israel from the plains of Moab, or more precisely, these are the words that people wrote at the end of the first Commonwealth, at the end of the ancient Israelite kingdom, right before the destruction of Jerusalem and Judea by the Babylonians, and imputed to Moses some 600 years before. Now, I don't like to belabor this, but since we're here, we all have to remember that books of the Torah, words of the Torah, the themes, the narratives, the myths, the poetry, are written by a person at a specific time, in a specific place, to a specific audience. And even if the audience is the future, there is a living audience for a specific purpose. So while we can certainly study the books on their own merits as eternal literature, especially since these kinds of books, let's say, unlike a play of Shakespeare, that scholars can detect what was happening and whom he borrowed from and what things were going on in his time. These books are moral teaching, and much of Deuteronomy is actually political morality, or originally it's called political science. The science of living together in the polis, in the city, which of course is a moral foundation. How ought people live together to, as it says here, to lengthen their days and create as much as possible the ideal way of people living together. So if you look at the book of Deuteronomy, when is the book of Deuteronomy written? First of all, a reflection that things have not worked out. There was a high point under Solomon, a few other kings, but in general, when you read the book of Kings, there's a constant degradation of both the kingdoms of Israel and Judea. The book of Kings is written from the prophetic point of view, meaning the critique of power. It's not a chronology of the kings written by kings. The books of Kings, Kings 1 and 2, are see the kings in a very unfavorable light. So it's written it's a prophetic critique of power, number one. And number two, there's a high point toward the end of what they call the first Israelite Commonwealth. Northern Israel has been destroyed. All we have is Judea. It's gotten, Hezekiah was a good king. Manasseh was a very bad king. His son Josiah was the greatest king. In fact, it says in Josiah, he was the greatest king ever, if you look at King Josiah. And then things went downhill from there until eventually the destruction. So this seems to have been written during the time of King Josiah. Why? Because we see in the end of Book of Kings that they discovered a book of the Torah in the temple when they were making repairs. So scholars look at the language at the end of the Second Kings and the language of Deuteronomy. It's a little bit of a different dialect of Hebrew. You wouldn't know this unless you were a Hebrew reader, which tells you the book was written with the same terminology, the same vocabulary, the same patterns of speech as the end of Kings, meaning they didn't discover the book, they wrote the book. And when they wrote this book under the time of the once and future king, King Josiah, you might say they wrote the book hoping, obviously, that the kingdom of Judea would extend into the future, which it did not. The Babylonians destroyed it. And what they wrote in the book of Deuteronomy was a Mishneh Torah, meaning a repetition of the Torah. Their idea being, if you read the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, there's law, but it's scattered all around. And there's holidays scattered all around, and there's stories scattered all around. But one thing that is not notable in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy is a pretty tight summary of those four books in a way that can be, from their perspective, easily memorized, and the laws are grouped together, which they're not in the first four books. In fact, if you look at the rabbinic theories of revelation, the book of Deuteronomy is a step down. because they believe that God already said everything God happened to needed to say in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And the book of Deuteronomy, I'm giving you an imaginary conversation. Moses says to God, it's really great. I really love it. It's kind of disorganized. You got to give a more compact digest. You need to give the Cliff Notes version so they can really memorize this thing. And God says, yeah, but I already said everything. Moses says, no, you really got to give them a summary. So that's the book of Deuteronomy. So even the rabbis admit it's not like the other four books because it's a Mishneh Torah. So my translation says a copy of the Sefer Torah. It's really a repetition. Moses Maimonides, when he did his great condensation of all Jewish law from his time, he called it the Mishneh Torah or the Mishnah Torah, naming his book after the book of Deuteronomy. So the last thing I want to say here is this hope, this belief. It says, now, so he's going to have this Mishneh Torah. You might say, whoever wrote it, and I'm going to attribute it to Jeremiah and his school. They wrote it for King Josiah to look at it and say, yes, this is everything we're supposed to know in a concentrated form. I want this written down, and every king after me has to read this so we don't have any more King Ahabs and any more Kings Manassas. They're going to train themselves to think as God wants them to think about morality and equity and good rule, and not using the power of the king to amass horses and to amass wives and to squander the royal treasury. And so it says he will read it all the days of his life so that he will learn to revere Adonai, his God, observe faithfully every word of these teachings. So they now, this is the thing I want to focus on. You don't read it once. Try to imagine, and I'll segue from here into my high holiday theme. Try to imagine that at this point in your life, however old you are, you sit down and write your Mishneh Torah. Everything you've experienced, all the laws of life that you have learned, the mistakes you've made, the mistakes that other people have made, wherever you are in life, where you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, you have learned the laws of life to that point in your life. The problem is we don't study what we have learned. We don't study what we have learned. Now try to imagine that this season of the year, Elul, you sit down and you write your Mishneh Torah. Everything that you learn, go year by year, mistakes that you've made, either b'mezid, like you knew you were doing it, you do it anyway, or bishgaga, you didn't know till much later that it was a mistake. Mistakes that other people made, b'mezid, intentionally to cause, with malice, and sometimes bishgaga, sometimes not knowing, but still, you've already seen a lot, however old you are. Of course, the older you get, the more you've seen, but we don't commit it to memory. So try to imagine, at least write an outline year by year, everything you've learned, then organize it into themes, and then you study it, because we know that the Yetzer Hara just take us off the path. Now, this is not foolproof all the way, because fools always find a way to ruin something good. But at least it gives us a chance to fight against the foolishness of the Yetzer Hara. Foolishnesses of the Yetzer Hara is it forgets the lessons of life, either because it has a bad memory or it wants to ignore them. It doesn't like to learn from mistakes, ours or others. It doesn't like to correct itself. It just wants to treat each day as if there's no past. Sometimes it's good to treat each day as new, but don't forget the lessons of life. So I want you to take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 19 and 20, and imagine that you are the sovereign of your life. And this is not about the kings of Israel back then. This is you right now during the month of Elul to get your life organized around the wisdom you have accumulated, so we actually can live transformed lives and not keep repeating our lives in the past. So this segues nicely. So that's my 10 minutes of Torah today, commenting on some part of our tradition.